Freemasons. They're the shadowy secret society who's controlling the world behind the scenes. Some of the richest and most powerful people in the world have been members of this order, and they've been using their power to influence and manipulate world events in their favor. At least that's what some conspiracy theorists would have you believe. Depending on who you ask, they're either a cabal of devil worshippers who run the world, or just a club of rich dudes who want to hang out with other rich dudes and drink beer without their wives bothering them. But as with most things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I'm Dantavius, how you doing? And today we're going to be talking about a Freemason lodge called Propaganda 2, or Propaganda 2, that basically took control of the entire country of Italy. And not only that, but they were involved in several scandals and conspiracies around the world. And let me tell you, I'm not exaggerating when I say this is one of the most insane stories you will ever hear. It involves the mafia, the Vatican, and the CIA.
Nearly 1,000 of Italy's elite, including 3 cabinet members, were allegedly members of an outlawed, super-secret, super-evil Masonic lodge called
Propaganda 2, or P2.
An illegal, ultra-secret political society of Italian Freemasons. In the 1970s, he inducted almost 1,000 of Italy's most powerful men in clandestine rituals here, in Rome's Excelsior Hotel.
Politicians, bankers, and mafiosi met here.
The secrecy of Masonic lodges provided the perfect place to conduct shady deals with figures from the business and political elite.
June 18th, 1982. A postal clerk was headed to his job in London one morning when he noticed something strange in the distance. As he passed by London's Blackfriars Bridge, he saw what looked to be a man hanging by his neck under the bridge. And it turns out that's exactly what it was. The man wore an expensive suit and had a Rolex on his wrist. When police searched the body, they found $1,400 in 4 different currencies and a passport with the name Gian Calvini. Well, it turns out the passport was a fake, and the guy's actual name was Roberto Calvi, a prominent Italian banker who was known as God's banker because of his close ties with the Vatican. His passing was officially ruled a suicide by British police, but it was more of a Epstein situation, but we'll get into that later though. Roberto Calvi ran one of the largest financial empires in the world, and a year before his passing away, his entire business collapsed. When investigators looked into it, they found out that our boy Calvi was up to some shady stuff. Fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, you know, the classics. The investigation also led police to a guy named Licio Gelli, a big-time mattress mogul. In 1981, they raided Gelli's house and discovered he was the leader of an Italian Freemason branch called Propaganda 2, or P2 for short. They also found a list of every member of his little club, and the people on this list weren't just a bunch of schmucks. The most powerful and influential people in all of Italy were on it, including Roberto Calvi himself. And if this sounds kind of like the plot to The Godfather Part 3, that's because it is. The movie is actually based on these events. But before we get into all that, let's talk about the history of the Freemasons briefly. But first, a word from our sponsors. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but I lost a little bit of weight recently.
Please clap.
You know, the hardest part about eating healthy for me is that I'm a lazy sack of shit, and a lot of the time I don't feel like cooking, so I just end up eating Chick-fil-A or something. Luckily, I started using Factor. Factor sends delicious, healthy meals directly to your door, so you don't have to waste any more time planning and prepping meals. They got chefs over there cooking up some tasty stuff, and all you gotta do is pop it in the microwave for like 2 minutes, and you're good to go. And this is healthy stuff, guys. Like, Factor is good for pretty much any diet. Keto, low calorie, even vegan. And their meal plans have a huge variety. The menu rotates weekly. You can choose your meals for yourselves or let Factor craft your order based on your taste preference and meal history. Look at this. Pork chimichurri, shredded beef and cheese, ground beef and rice, chicken teriyaki burger. Let's see how it tastes though. All right, let's try these here frijoles. Mmm! That's delicious! So guys, stop going to the grocery store and spending $300 on a bunch of stuff you're gonna throw away, alright? Stop ordering takeout every freaking day, stop wasting time and money, and head over to go.factor75.com/Dantavius130 and use my code Dantavius130 to get $130 off across 6 boxes. Guys, You're not gonna find a better deal than this anywhere. So go check out Factor immediately for some fast, delicious meals that fit your lifestyle. Thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video, and let's get back into it. It's believed that the Freemasons' roots go back to the stonemasons of the 14th century in England. These stonemasons started guilds, which kind of function similar to how labor unions do today. And the guilds had meeting places called lodges, where members would meet up to socialize, train, discuss their craft. And let's be honest, a lot of gay stuff probably happened too. Then in 1717, 4 lodges in London joined together to form the Grand Lodge. From its humble beginnings as a couple of schmuck stonemasons, the fraternity eventually grew into an exclusive group of some of the most powerful men in history, including George Washington, Winston Churchill, Colonel Sanders, and Shaq. By the late 1700s, Freemasons were pretty much everywhere, which brings us to Italy. You guys know Italy, right? I cook a pizza, that place. By the mid-1800s, Freemasons and other secret societies had gained a lot of power and influence, even rivaling the Catholic Church itself. It was during this period that Propaganda 1, the precursor to P2, was formed in 1876. So things were going pretty good for Italian Freemasons for a while, until 1925, when a fella by the name of Benito Mussolini came to power. He stomped out anything that could potentially challenge his authority and viewed the Masons as a threat. So, during Mussolini's reign, the order had pretty much completely dissolved. And after the fascists lost the war, the Freemasons came back and they had to rebuild their order from the ground up. This provided big opportunities for certain individuals. One of those individuals was Licio Gelli, aka King Cobra. Shit, that's a cool nickname. Gelli took control of P2 in the 60s and turned it into one of the most powerful organizations in the world. At its height, the lodge was home to most of Italy's elite class, and P2 had such a tight grip on the country that it was referred to by many as a parallel government or a shadow government, which it definitely was. They had a hand in pretty much every significant event that happened in Italy in the 70s and 80s, and outside of Italy too. And Licio Gelli was the puppet master who controlled it all. So who was this guy? At first glance, he doesn't look very impressive. Big ass glasses, goofy ass smile. There's no way this guy could have been the mastermind behind the secret shadow government. Well, looks can be deceiving. You see, the thing you gotta understand about Gelli is that the dude was a hardcore fascist. And I'm not saying fascist in the modern sense of the word, which is anybody that disagrees with me politically. I mean a real fascist. He was once quoted in an interview as saying, "I am a fascist, and I will die a fascist." Well, I mean, that doesn't really leave too much room for interpretation. But I mean, you gotta give it to the guy. He didn't beat around the bush. I bring this up because it's actually a pretty important part of this story, but let's take a look at how this unassuming looking guy came to his position of power. During World War II, Licio was a big fan of Benito Mussolini. When Italy renounced its alliance with Nazi Germany in 1943, Gelli joined Mussolini and other fascists in the creation of the Republic of Salo, a German puppet state in northern Italy. When the Axis powers were defeated at the end of the war, he fled to Argentina to escape being charged with war crimes, as one does. While in exile, he became friends with Argentina's dictator, Juan Perón, who would later be inducted into the Freemasons by Gelli himself. It's also been speculated that he started working with the CIA around this time. More on that later. After a few years in Argentina, Gelli decided to head back to Italy, where he started a successful mattress company. Then, in 1962, he would officially become a member of the Freemasons, where he quickly rose through the ranks. By 1968, the Freemason leadership decided to make Gelli the head of the once great Propaganda Masonica Lodge, now known as Propaganda 2. But my man Licio had bigger ambitions. He didn't want to just lead some glorified country club where rich old fucks sip martinis and eat gabagool. So he set out to make P2 a force to be reckoned with. Now, in the late 60s to the late 80s, tensions were high in the world. It was a rough time for everybody. The Cold War was going on, everyone was under a constant threat of nuclear war. But things were especially bad in Italy, where this period was known as the Years of Lead because of the massive amounts of violence and political turmoil. Over the course of about 20 years, there were a total of 8 terrorist attacks, 2 failed coups, and more assassinations than you can count. Well, unless you can count to 400. There was 400 assassination attempts about. And this also happened to coincidentally be the same exact time period that Licio Gelli was the leader of P2. So I think there may be a slight chance that these two things are related. but I'll let you guys decide. Let's take a look at some of the events that P2 were involved with. Allegedly, December 12, 1969, a bomb goes off at a bank in Milan, taking the lives of 17 people and wounding 88 more. The attack was initially blamed on anarchists because, why not? 80 suspected anarchists were arrested in connection to the attack. During the investigation, one suspect, Giuseppe Pinelli, fell out of a 4th-story window and, he didn't make it. His untimely demise was ruled to be accidental, the result of him fainting due to exhaustion and conveniently falling out of the window. The police commissioner who interrogated him was later assassinated in retaliation. It was later discovered that the attack was actually carried out by Ordino Nuevo, or New Order, a far-right neo-fascist group who carried out a similar string of bombings the same year. In 1972, 2 men were arrested in connection with the bombing, Franco Freda and Giovanni Ventura. Now, they were eventually acquitted, but the case didn't get resolved until 2004. And a big reason it took so long is because of a classic case of obstruction of justice. General Giandelio Maletti destroyed evidence implicating the 2 members of Ordino Nuevo, and, the general just happened to be a member of P2. Then we got the Golpe Borghese coup. Giunio Borghese was a member of a prominent noble family. During World War II, he, like Licio Gelli, joined the Republic of Salo and fought for the Nazis. After the war, he was charged with collaborating with Germany and served 4 years in prison. But despite this, he was still pretty popular and considered a war hero by many. After WW2, Borghese went into politics and gained the nickname the Black Prince due to his extremely far-right views. And again, that's a cool-ass nickname. Like, you gotta give it to these fascists, they were good at nicknames. Bad at human rights, but good at nicknames. Borghese was unsatisfied with the growing presence of liberalism and leftism in Italy, so he decided to do the most reasonable thing he can think of and plan a coup to overthrow the government where he would install himself as president. The plan was simple. Step 1, kidnap the current president. Step 2, whack the head of police. Step 3, take over the Ministry of Defense. And Step 4, profit. But he couldn't do this alone, so he enlisted the help of a few different groups. First was the New Order that was behind the Piazza Fontana bombing I just mentioned. Then he made a deal with the mafia, who agreed to help in exchange for leniency once Borghese came to power. And finally, it should be no surprise that P2 was also heavily involved in this plot. In fact, P2 members were the ones tasked with arresting the sitting president, while the mafia was supposed to whack the chief of police. But then out of nowhere, right when the coup was supposed to go down, like literally the night of the coup, right when everybody was ready for some good old-fashioned cooing, Borghese called the whole thing off. Jeez, man, this is like when you're supposed to go on a date with the girl and you're at the restaurant, she hits you with the, "You're gonna hate me." Now, you may be thinking, well, he had to have had a pretty good reason to call it off right when shit was about to get spicy, right? Well, according to Borghese himself, he called it off because it was raining. I mean, in all fairness, it's dangerous to do a coup while it's raining. Somebody could slip and hurt themselves. By the time Borghese shut the whole operation down, a lot of people had already started carrying out the plan. You guys gotta remember, this was the 80s. There was no WhatsApp back then. There was no iMessage. So it took a while for everybody to get on the same page, but by the time the message got out, it was already too late. The government found out about the plot. And when the time came to charge people for crimes, evidence linking Licio Gelli and fellow P2 members was destroyed by the Secret Service. You'll notice that this becomes a bit of a pattern. As for Borghese himself, he fled to Spain where he would later die of poisoning. Heart attack. He died of a heart attack. Definitely no foul play involved. After being involved in scandal after scandal, the other Freemason leadership decided that Gelli was bringing down too much heat on them.
You said I'm bringing heat on you? I gotta listen to people because of your fucking shit? You're ordering me out? You better get your own fucking army, pal.
So they revoked P2's charter and essentially excommunicated them from the order. Keep in mind that Freemasons at this time were not considered a secret society in Italy, as they were registered with the Italian government. But once P2 was kicked out of the Freemason network, they became a secret society, which was illegal under Italian law. But if you think our boy Licio give a shit about laws, then you got another thing coming. His contempt for laws would become even more apparent when he allegedly kidnapped and whacked politician Aldo Moro, who also happened to be the former prime minister. On March 15, 1978, the ultra-left-wing terrorist group known as the Red Brigades attacked Aldo's car, whacked his bodyguards, and then kidnapped him. While Moro was being held prisoner, the Red Brigades offered to free him in exchange for releasing some of their members from prison. The government declined, and Aldo's body was later found in the trunk of a car. Now, the extent of P2's involvement in this situation isn't clear, but they were definitely involved in some way, because a journalist named Carmine Pecorelli wrote an article implicating P2 in the incident, and he got whacked not too long after. And I wish it ended there. In the summer of 1980, a suitcase bomb exploded at a Bologna train station, taking the lives of 85 people and injuring 200. 2 members of a far-right extremist group were charged with the attack, but it turns out they were framed by the deputy director of the SISMI, which is like the Italian version of the CIA. This dude falsified evidence against these 2 schmucks.
If the instigators of the massacre were never discovered, it is undoubtedly thanks to the maneuvers of this man, convicted for obstructing justice in the course of the inquiry. Licio Gelli, the venerable master of a Masonic lodge known as Propaganda Due.
And that's only a few of the incidents they were involved in, alright? If I included them all, this video would be like 3 hours long, so I just included the most important ones. But this begs the question, why did P2 do all of this? What was the purpose of all this chaos? Well, all this stuff was going down during the very height of the Cold War. Russia and America were fighting for influence, and the spread of communism had to be stopped by any means necessary. In the years following World War II, Italy faced a growing leftist presence. Communism began to gain popularity among the people, and leftist politicians were winning a lot of seats in parliament.
From Borghese's attempted coup to the Bologna bombing, the shadow of Gelli looms large over every despicable news story in latter-day Italy. He was driven by a single motive: to keep the communists away from government, a priority objective for Italy's American friend as well.
So, of course, the CIA decided to get involved. Allegedly. You see, the CIA has a long and rich history of supporting far-right extremists and helping them overthrow democratically elected governments. Like, as soon as there was a hint of communism anywhere, they would do a coup. They were so desperate to stop the spread of communism in Europe that they were willing to team up with anyone. And they did. That's where Gladio comes in. Gladio was the name of a top-secret operation where the CIA funded, trained, and infiltrated European anti-communist groups to counteract the Soviet Union's influence.
One of the primary, indispensable principles of American foreign policy. And that principle is to maintain the necessary strength in the Mediterranean to preserve the peace against those who might threaten the peace.
The original intent of Gladio was to have like a secret fighting force ready in case the communist countries ever decided to push into Western Europe. But it turned into something much darker. Many of the terrorist attacks that happened in Italy during the years of lead were a result of Gladio. Oh, and don't think for a second that the Russians weren't doing the same thing. There was essentially an underground proxy war being fought in Europe between CIA and KGB-backed groups, and P2 was a huge part of this puzzle. Most of its members were former fascists, and they were willing to do whatever it takes to stop leftists from taking over Europe, even if that meant hundreds of people had to die in the process. So they were a perfect ally for the CIA and received a ton of funding and protection. Allegedly, okay? Allegedly. Unproven. But I mean, come on. P2's reign of terror would continue all throughout the 70s and 80s, but as all good things tend to do, this too would soon come to an end. And much like the 2008 financial collapse, it was the bankers' fault.
The story of an Italian banker. For a while, he had the Midas touch. He masterminded a financial empire. It enriched fascists and priests, bankers and swindlers. When it finally all crashed, the scandal reached even to the inner sanctum of the Catholic Church. Tonight, the story of the man called God's banker.
So for this next part, I sourced most of my information from the book God's Bankers by Gerald Posner. So if I quote anything, it's probably from that book. Banco Ambrosiano was founded in 1896 by Giuseppe Tovini, a devout Catholic who was sick of secular banks that fucked over their fellow man. So he set out to create a truly Christian bank that operated ethically, piously, and charitably, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. In 1947, Roberto Calvi started working at Banco Ambrosiano at the age of 26. He was a workaholic and quickly rose through the ranks, going from an entry-level clerk to the director of operations. But he was too ambitious for his own good. Despite having a good job with dental benefits and a 401k, Calvi wanted more. He wanted to turn Banco Ambrosiano into the biggest bank in Italy and was limited by the bureaucracy, so he needed help. That help would come in the form of Michele Sindona, also known as the Shark. Sindona was an international banker who worked for the mafia. This guy was a big freaking deal. He owned several banks all over the world and used them to launder money for the Gambino crime family. He also functioned as a sort of accountant for the mob. Calvi met with Sindona in 1968 and told him, quote, Ambrosiano held large sums of money in the safe. He would like to use that cash in more aggressive ventures with Sindona. The problem was, the bank's conservative board of directors was certain to reject it as too risky. After hearing this, Sindona started drooling and his eyes turned to dollar signs. After this meeting, Sindona would introduce Calvi to a few different people, one of them being Licio Gelli, who inducted Calvi into the Freemasons, and another was Paul Marcinkus, an archbishop from Chicago who was a close personal friend to the Pope. A little bit of a sidebar, but Marcinkus was a pretty interesting guy on his own. His nickname was the Gorilla because the dude was built more like a WWE wrestler than a priest, at 6'4", 250 pounds. I mean, I could probably still take him, but because of his large frame, Marcinkus served as a bodyguard to Pope Paul VI, who he actually saved from getting stabbed in 1970. And after that attack, the two became very close. So on top of being an archbishop and a bodyguard, Marcinkus was also appointed to be secretary of the Vatican Bank by the Pope himself. Only issue was, this man didn't know shit about banking, alright? I know more about banking than he did. Marcinkus met Sindona soon after his promotion because Sindona worked as a financial advisor for the Vatican. Sindona would later say in an interview that Marcinkus was in over his head, inept at financial matters, and not very smart. But despite knowing less about banking than I know about pleasing a woman, Marcinkus was promoted to the president of the entire bank in 1971, just 4 short years after being made secretary. The same year, our boy Roberto Calvi became president of Banco Ambrosiano, probably with the help of Sindona. So now Calvi had some pretty powerful allies on his side. He had the backing of the Vatican, the Freemasons, and one of the biggest bankers of the world. And Calvi didn't waste any time in expanding his empire. He started opening up dozens of secret offshore banks in the Bahamas and creating shell companies in Europe. You know, typical scummy banker stuff. And in a few short years, he was able to make Banco Ambrosiano not only the largest bank in Italy, but one of the most powerful banking organizations in the entire world. Things were going smoothly for a while, but then Sindona started fucking up. In 1972, Sindona, with the help of Calvi and the mafia, was able to buy the 18th largest bank in the US, Franklin National. And as you guys know, nothing good can come from something named Franklin. So after the acquisition, Sindona starts making a lot of investments in the US and convinces Calvi to do the same, at which point the two of them started making friends with powerful people, like this fella, Richard Nixon. Sindona even donated $5 million to Nixon's campaign. Oh, and after I recorded everything, I found out that Sindona actually owned the Watergate Hotel at the time that Nixon's scandal was going on. So he was involved in that too. After being in charge of Franklin National for just 10 months, his risky investments started to bite him in the ass. The bank was losing millions of dollars and their stock fell by 80%, which caught the attention of the Security and Exchange Commission, who opened an investigation into Sindona, which revealed that he in fact was not an upstanding businessman, but a scoundrel. The National Bank of Italy also opened up their own investigation at the same time and confirmed that he was in fact a scoundrel and charged him with falsifying accounts and a bunch of other crimes. At this point, Sindona's entire financial empire was crumbling and he went on the run to avoid arrest. Marcinkus was also in the shit because a lot of the Vatican's money was tied up in Sindona's businesses. I'm talking billions of dollars. It was not a good look to say the least. Marcinkus was desperate to cut the Vatican's financial losses, so he basically gave Roberto Calvi carte blanche over the church's investments in an attempt to gain back some of the money that was lost. So Marcinkus and Calvi would get very cozy, with Calvi even placing Marcinkus on the board of one of his banks in the Bahamas. So this story's already pretty insane, but it gets even crazier. On July 11, 1979, Giorgio Ambrosoli, an Italian lawyer who investigated Sindona and discovered all of his shady dealings, was gunned down in front of his home in Milan. Witnesses say the gunman spoke with an Italian-American accent. 2 days later, the chief of police, who was currently investigating P2's connections with Sindona, was also whacked. Then, 10 days after that, somebody else got whacked. This time, the target was Boris Giuliano, the leader of an Italian anti-racketeering task force who was pursuing, quote, credible leads about tens of millions laundered by Sicilian heroin traffickers and disguised as legal transfers through Sindona-owned banks in Italy and Switzerland. After this string of definitely random and in no way connected murders, Michel Sindona's secretary would get a call from a man who was using a voice changer to disguise his voice and said,
"Sindona is our prisoner. You will be hearing from us."
As the weeks went on, nobody knew if Sindona was alive or dead until Italian police received a letter asking for money in exchange for Sindona's release. But there was one issue. They caught the idiot who delivered the letter on camera. It was Vinny Spatola, a member of the Gambino crime family. A few days after Spatola was arrested, Sindona's lawyer, Marvin Frankel, got a phone call from none other than Michel Sindona himself. He said to Frankel, "I was kidnapped, but I'm free now." He had been missing for a total of 76 days at that point, and he claimed that he was kidnapped by far-left activists. And I shit you not, he also said he had amnesia, like they drugged him the whole time so he couldn't remember anything. Alright, I'm gonna stop beating around the bush. The dude kidnapped himself, like he staged his own kidnapping to win sympathy with the jury for his upcoming court trial. But it didn't work, because he got charged with, like, everything. Fraud, racketeering, money laundering, emulating Nintendo games.
I'm playing Mario 3 on my Mac. This time next week, you'll find me in a fucking ditch.
Everything. And it didn't stop there. The FBI also received the tip that Sindona hired a mafia hitman to whack the Italian prosecutor who was after him. And you know who gave the FBI that tip? Henry fucking Hill. Yes, the main character from Goodfellas. The guy who was played by Ray Liotta gave the tip while he was an informant. So Sindona got charged with that too, along with all the other stuff, and had to serve like 200 years in prison. But during his incarceration, his coffee was poisoned with cyanide and he passed away. R.I.P. So now Sindona's out of the picture, but he was only the first domino to fall. The whole scandal brought a ton of heat onto Calvi and Marcinkus. Italian authorities were now aggressively investigating Calvi's business dealings, and it wouldn't be long before they found a metric fuck ton of dirt. He was illegally moving money out of the country, embezzling funds, manipulating currencies, laundering money. Basically anything bad you can do as a banker, this guy was doing. And on top of all that other stuff, there was hundreds of millions of dollars that just went missing, just disappeared into thin air. It was later discovered that a lot of these funds were sent to right-wing paramilitary groups in South America that were trying to overthrow left-wing governments.
But an ABC News investigation shows that much of the missing money was funneled to right-wing Latin American political leaders and organizations in a major operation to solidly establish the bank as an international financial institution, and to stem what the promoters of the project perceived as the rise of communism in Latin America.
And he was using the Vatican to do all his dirty work. So here's what the scheme was. Calvi was essentially using the Catholic Church to hide where his money was going. Since the Vatican wasn't under as much scrutiny as regular banks, they would use it to funnel money to shell companies in the Bahamas and Panama without anybody noticing. So for example, Calvi would deposit $10 million in the Vatican's bank. He would then use that money to buy stocks. He would transfer those stocks to his shell companies, after which they would increase in value. Then he would continue transferring that money to other shell companies owned by Calvi, and the more that these shares circulated, the more value they would gain, and eventually they would get sold again on the Milan Stock Exchange for way more money than what he bought them for. And the whole time this was going on, Marcinkus would make sure nobody within the Vatican itself knew about the schemes that they were cooking up.
The players in this complicated jigsaw puzzle could fit into a spy novel. Calvi, president of Banco Ambrosiano, who became known as God's banker for his financial dealings with the Vatican. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the former Cicero, Illinois parish priest, who became the confidant of popes and the president of the Vatican Bank. Licio Gelli, the founder and grand master of the now outlawed right-wing Propaganda 2, or P2 Masonic Lodge. His chief aide, Italian lawyer Umberto Ortolani. and Gelli and Sindona, the man who originally brought together the elements of this jigsaw puzzle and ironically provided the first evidence to ABC News of where the money went.
Eventually, Calvi was charged with fraudulently moving $20 million out of the country and got sentenced to 4 years in prison. But before he got locked up, he used a disguise and a fake passport to flee to London. After about a week on the run, Calvi would be found under the Blackfriars Bridge in London, with a nylon rope around his neck and 12 pounds of bricks in his pockets. British investigators ruled that Calvi had hanged himself. Yeah, so did Epstein, huh? It was pretty clear that Calvi was whacked because he screwed up and he knew too much. He was a liability to not only P2, but also the mafia and the Vatican, so he had to go. The fact that he was found under the Blackfriars Bridge was not random. The members of Propaganda 2 were also known as Blackfriars, so it was basically a show of force. It was their way of subtly saying, yeah, we did this. What are you gonna do about it, bitch? Kind of based, honestly. Now, Licio Gelli was actually on the run at the time of Calvi's passing. See, when Sindona got pinched, investigators were able to find a paper trail linking him to Gelli. So they searched his villa in Milan and hit the jackpot. The man was a certified hoarder and had thousands of incriminating documents, including evidence of bribing politicians, blackmail, extortion, and obstruction of justice. He even had a naked picture of Pope John Paul II in his safe. I'm not even kidding. But the most significant thing that was found during this raid was a list of every member of Propaganda 2. Pretty much anyone who was anyone was a member of this club. Sindona and Calvi, of course, were in it, but also the 3 heads of Italian intelligence agencies, the owner of the biggest newspaper in Italy, mafia members, politicians, bankers, army generals, policemen, even fucking Mario was probably a member. Do you guys understand how insane this is? Like, imagine if the CEOs of Chase and Wells Fargo were in a secret group with the heads of the CIA, FBI, and NSA, and the owner of the Wall Street Journal, with multiple politicians. He escaped to Switzerland where he was arrested after trying to withdraw $50 million and they put him in jail. But he escaped and fled to South America where he would spend the next 5 years. Eventually though, he got bored or something and gave himself up. While he was on the run, Italian authorities were building a case, and this man's file was thicker than your mom. Prosecutors were going after him for the Bologna train bombing that I mentioned before, in addition to the whacking of Roberto Calvi, funding extremist groups, obstructing justice, and of course, bank fraud. But after all was said and done, the only thing they got him on was obstruction of justice related to the Bologna train attack, right? The Italian intelligence guy who falsified evidence was a member of P2 and did that at the request of Gelli to turn attention away from their organization. So he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. On top of that, he was also found guilty for financial crimes related to Banco Ambrosiano. Pretty much all the other charges were dropped and he received 18 years in prison. When Gelli heard that he wasn't going to get off scot-free, he ran away again. This time he went to France, but police caught up to him pretty quickly. Even after all that, he had to serve, I think it was a total of 20-something years in prison, but spent the rest of his life on house arrest in his beautiful Italian villa. Like, they basically sentenced him to retirement. The dude was like 83 years old. Oh, and whatever happened to Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank?
3 independent bankers appointed by the Vatican judged that Marcinkus was a victim. He was conned. Since it's a sovereign state, he is out of reach of Italian investigators. The question of how much Marcinkus knew of Calvi's operation is central to the rest of our story. Certainly, even after being burned by Sindona 8 years ago, Marcinkus stayed in his job and kept on doing business with Calvi.
Well, Italian authorities decided that the Vatican was out of their jurisdiction, so the Pope relocated him to Arizona, where he spent the rest of his life playing golf. But hey, at least he wasn't diddling kids. Gelli passed away in 2015, but one thing's for sure, this evil Keebler elf-looking mother sucker permanently changed history. Many of the people who were in power in Italy to this day were affiliated with P2. The longest-running prime minister in Italian history and current member of European Parliament was a member of P2. It just goes to show that a small man can cast a huge shadow. Also, researching this made me realize that it's not Jews who control the world like all those knucklehead conspiracy theorists say. It's Italians. But anyways, I hope you guys found this story as interesting as I did. As you can see, I wasn't exaggerating how crazy it all was. If you want to see more stuff like this, please like the video and subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss anything. And shout out to all the patrons who subsidize my lifestyle of smoking cigars and driving Bugattis. Also, please check me out on other social media. It's all in the description of this video. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. God bless.